Under the weight of centuries, the walls hold more than stones. They hold voices never heard, pages never meant to see the light, confessions written in ink and tears. VATILEAKS, the name whispered in the world's most sacred corridors, where power is clothed in purple and secrecy hides behind every crucifix. There are moments in history when the invisible grows tired of remaining hidden, and the silence, too heavy, begins to bleed through the cracks. What is revealed when the guardians of the faith are forced to confront their own shadows? When confidential documents, kept under lock and key in the Vatican's most protected archives, find their way into the hands of the profane world? VATILEAKS was not just a scandal. It was a muffled cry that echoed through marble and gold, revealing that even the most sacred temples carry within them the weight of human imperfection. It was a tear in the veil, an open wound in the mystical body of the Church, exposing nerves that should never have been touched. Imagine corridors where every footstep resonates like an unspoken confession. Rooms where letters are written with trembling hands, knowing that each word can trigger earthquakes in ancient foundations. The Vatican has always been a place of mystery, but VATILEAKS brought something different to the surface. Not the mystery of the divine, but the mystery of human weakness cloaked in sacred authority. Power struggles disguised as liturgy. Corruption hidden beneath cloaks of sanctity. Intrigues that brewed in the shadows while the world prayed outside. The year was marked by a tension no one could name. Something was about to break. And when the first documents began to leak, when secret pages appeared published in books that became global bestsellers, the shock came not only from the revelation of the secrets, but from the fact that someone from within had chosen to betray the silence. Someone had decided that certain truths were too heavy to remain buried, and this decision shook not only the Vatican, but the very notion of what it means to be the guardian of a mystery. If this mystery has touched you, stay until the end. There's something you need to hear. Because VATILEAKS isn't just about roles and scandals, it's about the moment when the sacred and the profane meet in a dark corridor, and no one knows which is which anymore. It's about the fragility of trust when it's tested by power. It's about the impossible choice between loyalty and truth. Do you feel that what has been forgotten still calls to us? Because there are secrets that, even when revealed, continue to beg to be understood. And this is one of them. Behind every sacred institution lies a human structure, fallible, complex, permeated by ambitions and fears that no ritual can completely purify. The Vatican, the smallest state in the world, is also one of the most powerful centers of spiritual and political influence in history. Within its walls, decisions affecting millions of souls are made not only in prayer, but in closed meetings, in whispered conversations, in alliances that form and dissolve like incense smoke. The Roman Curia, the set of institutions that governs the Catholic Church, has always functioned as a living, breathing organism, where different schools of thought and power coexist in precarious balance. Cardinals represent different worldviews, different interests, different interpretations of what it means to serve God and lead the flock. And as in any structure where power is at stake, there are tensions, there are hidden disputes. There are those who believe that true holiness lies in preserving tradition at any cost, and there are those who feel that the Church needs to open up, transform itself, and confront its own wounds. It was in this context that documents began to disappear. Confidential letters from cardinals, internal reports on financial irregularities, communications that revealed deep conflicts within the very heart of the papal administration. Someone was copying, storing, preparing an exposure no one expected. And this someone wasn't an external enemy. It was someone on the inside, someone who walked the same sacred corridors, who knew the codes, who had access to what should remain inviolable. What drives a person to break the most sacred silence? What kind of pain, what kind of moral certainty, what kind of desperation could make someone choose revelation over obedience? VATILEAKS was born of this tension between the duty to protect the institution and the impulse to expose what corrupts within. It was born from the belief that certain truths, when hidden, become poisons that contaminate everything around them. And then the books began to appear. Printed pages with authentic documents, signed by important figures, revealing conversations that should never have left the archives. The world read about questionable contracts, about factional disputes within the Vatican, about cardinals who warned the Pope about corruption and were ignored. It read about a system that, according to the leaked documents themselves, was in urgent need of reform, but which resisted any change with the strength of centuries of tradition. Each layer that reveals itself brings another shadow. Keep watching. The veil hasn't yet completely lifted. Because VATILEAKS wasn't just a leak, it was a mirror held up to an institution that had always preferred to look upward. And the reflection was disturbing. It revealed not just administrative errors, but a crisis of identity, an internal struggle between what the Church claimed to be and what actually happened when the doors closed. Some said this exposure was necessary, a painful but inevitable purification. Others saw it as an unforgivable betrayal, a desecration of the sacred in the name of worldly justice. But all agreed on one point. Something had broken. Trust, that invisible fabric that sustains every structure of authority, had been torn, and the sound of that tear would echo for years. Documents don't lie, but they never tell the whole truth either. They are fragments of a larger reality, bits of conversation that took on a life of their own when ripped from their context. And yet, each leaked page carried the weight of a revelation. Letters from cardinals expressing concern about the Vatican State's financial management. Memoranda about construction and renovation contracts that seemed to favor specific companies without transparent processes. Communications that revealed a system where personal loyalties often outweighed competence or integrity. One of the most shocking documents concerned the Vatican Bank itself, an institution shrouded in mystery, and, over the decades, scandals that never seemed to be fully resolved. There were references to questionable transactions, internal resistance to audits, and a system that operated with opacity incompatible with the values the Church preached to the world. For millions of faithful who placed their faith and donations in a transparent and holy institution, these revelations were like a punch in the gut. But VATILEAKS didn't just expose financial irregularities. He exposed something perhaps even more disturbing: the power struggles, factions, alliances, and betrayals that took place behind the scenes. Documents revealed how certain cardinals actively worked to undermine reforms proposed by others, how groups operated not in pursuit of the common good of the Church, but to preserve their own circles of influence, how decisions that should have been guided by the Holy Spirit were, in fact, the result of very human political negotiations, and at the center of it all, the figure of the Pope, the one who should be above worldly disputes, the one who should be the unquestionable shepherd, appeared in the documents as someone surrounded by wolves in sheep's clothing, advisors who didn't have his best interests at heart, collaborators who filtered information, who hid realities, who created protective bubbles that prevented the pontiff from seeing the true extent of the problems. A pope prisoner of his own court. Comment on what your instincts feel. Is it faith or is it fear? The most profound answers often come from silence, because when believers around the world read those documents, something changed. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a kind of painful awakening. The realization that the institution to which they dedicated their spirituality was run by human beings with all their flaws, their vanities, their petty cruelties. The whistleblower was identified. A man who served in the papal apartments, someone whose role was discreet but close enough to have access to things he shouldn't have. When he was discovered, the shock was twofold. First, that someone so close could betray such trust. Second, that his motivations appeared neither financial nor political, but born of a kind of moral desperation, the belief that exposure was the only way to force change that would never come from within. If truth touches the invisible, leave a sign of light, a silent yet powerful gesture. Because VATILEAKS reminds us of something essential. Secrets are like buried seeds. They can remain hidden for generations, but all it takes is a crack of light for them to begin to germinate. And once they do, there's no way to return them to the darkness. The documents continued to circulate. Journalists devoted years to analyzing them, connecting the dots, revealing patterns. And each new analysis brought an additional layer of understanding, not just about what went wrong in the Vatican, but about how sacred institutions, when not constantly renewed and purified, can become structures that protect their own interests more than the values they were meant to represent. There are wars that are not fought with weapons, but with words whispered in antechambers. There are battles where the battlefield is the human soul, torn between the duty to obey and the call of conscience. VATILEAKS unleashed one such war, an invisible but fierce struggle for the heart of the Catholic Church. On one side, there were those who believed the institution should protect its secrets at any cost, for exposing them would give ammunition to the enemies of the faith. On the other, there were those who felt that, without transparency, without honestly confronting its own errors, the institution was doomed to repeat the same cycles of corruption and scandal. The whistleblower was tried and convicted. But the trial didn't bring closure. It raised more questions. Was there compassion for someone who, according to his own defense, acted out of love for the Church and a desire to see it purified? Or was there simply condemnation for someone who broke the most sacred trust, who violated the code of silence that underpins every hierarchy? The answer depended on who you asked. And this division of opinion revealed something profound about the state of the Church itself. There was no consensus on what was more important, institutional loyalty or moral truth. Within the Vatican, the consequences were seismic. Security systems were overhauled. Document access protocols were tightened. But more than that, there was an erosion of trust that no new protocol could restore. Cardinals eyed one another with renewed suspicion. Collaborators were monitored with a rigor that bordered on paranoia. The environment, once marked by sacred formality, became permeated with fear. Fear of being the next to have one's communications exposed. Fear that every word could become evidence. Fear that the Church itself was devouring itself from within. Those who remain here carry the weight of revelation. Which side of the veil would you choose, belief or oblivion? Because VATILEAKS forces us to confront a question that transcends religion. What do we do when we discover that what we believed in doesn't correspond to reality? Do we continue to believe, adjusting our faith to accommodate disappointment? Or do we abandon everything, deciding that if the institution is flawed, then faith itself must be questioned? For many believers, the answer was to find a middle ground, to acknowledge the institution's imperfect humanity without abandoning the spirituality it represented, to separate the message from the messengers. But for others, VATILEAKS was the final straw in a chalice already overflowing with disappointment. Sexual abuse scandals the Church tried to hide for decades, financial irregularities that repeated themselves generation after generation, stubborn resistance to any form of modernization or reform, all created an image of an institution more concerned with preserving itself than serving. And in the center of this hurricane, an unprecedented decision loomed. Something that hadn't happened in centuries. Something so shocking that even those who closely followed Vatican events couldn't believe it until the moment it happened. A papal resignation. A pontiff who, faced with the weight of crises, revelations, and seemingly endless internal struggles, made the decision to step down. Subscribe and walk with us. Each new video is a key, and each key unlocks another seal. Because VATILEAKS' story doesn't end with the whistleblower's trial. In fact, that was just the beginning of a transformation that is still ongoing. The Church was forced to look at itself in a way it perhaps hadn't in centuries. And that look, painful as it was, may have been necessary. Some say that without VATILEAKS, the Church would have continued on its path of denial, postponing essential reforms, allowing problems to accumulate to an irreversible breaking point. Others say that VATILEAKS was an unnecessary wound, a betrayal that weakened the Church at a time when it needed to be strong to face an increasingly secularized world. Both perspectives hold truth, and this ambiguity is what makes history so complex, so human, so impossible to judge in simple terms of right and wrong. There are moments in history when the veil between the visible and the invisible becomes so thin that it becomes possible to see through it, not with the eyes, but with something deeper. The moment a pope resigns is one of those moments. It hadn't happened in over 600 years. The very idea seemed impossible. The one chosen to serve until death, the one who bears the weight of direct apostolic succession from Peter, the one considered infallible in matters of faith. Can this man simply leave? The resignation was announced in a dead language, Latin, as if using an ancient language could soften the shock of such a modern act. The words were spoken with the same solemnity as one would celebrate Mass. But behind the liturgical formality, there was something deeply human, an elderly, weary man, recognizing that he no longer had the strength to carry the burden. A man who, surrounded by intrigues that VATILEAKS exposed to the world, decided that the best service he could render to the Church was to step aside. Some saw in this decision extraordinary courage, the humility to acknowledge limitations, to place the good of the institution above one's own ego. Some saw defeat, a capitulation to the forces that sought to weaken him, a confirmation that VATILEAKS' revelations had been too devastating to overcome. And some saw mystery, the suspicion that there was more behind this resignation than would ever be revealed, deeper secrets that might never come to light. The ritual of papal transition is one of the oldest and most symbolic in the Church. When a pope dies, there are centuries-old processes. The fisherman's ring is destroyed, symbols of authority are collected, and a conclave is called to choose a successor. But when a pope resigns, rituals needed to be adapted and reinvented. It was as if the Church were writing a new chapter in its book of traditions, forced by circumstances to improvise in an area where everything had always been governed by millennia-old precedents. If you've made it this far, you're already part of this ritual. Simply watching is participating. Because VATILEAKS isn't just a story that happened far away, among people of power and influence we'll never meet. It's a story about us, about how we deal with disappointment, about how we react when the institutions we trust reveal their flaws, about the choice between closing our eyes or forcing our eyes to see. The successor arrived from the other side of the world, a cardinal who came from a place where the church was still growing, where faith still pulsed vigorously in poor communities that found in religion not only spiritual comfort, but also strength to face social injustices. And this successor brought with him a powerful symbolism, the choice of a name that no pope had used before, a name that harked back to the saint most associated with poverty, humility, and reform: Francis. It was a clear, if unspoken, message. The Church needed to return to its roots. It needed to strip away the trappings it had accumulated over the centuries, the power structures that had become ends in themselves, the protections and secrets that VATILEAKS so brutally exposed. It needed to become again what it should always have been: a community of faith, not an administrative empire. Leave your message in the comments. This is how silence becomes community. Because true transformation never comes solely from above, from papal decrees or institutional reforms. It comes from below, from each person deciding what to do with the uncomfortable truths that have been revealed. Will you remain? Will you break? Will you fight for change from within? Will you become a voice demanding accountability and transparency? In the years following VATILEAKS, changes began to take place. Some superficial, others more profound. The Vatican Bank underwent reforms, though many argued they weren't enough. Financial transparency processes were implemented, despite internal resistance. Sexual abuse cases began to be treated more seriously, though the pace frustrated victims who had waited decades for justice. But perhaps the greatest change has been invisible, a transformation in the collective consciousness of Catholics around the world. The understanding that faith does not mean blindness, that reverence for the institution does not require silence in the face of its errors, that being Catholic does not mean passively accepting everything that comes from Rome, but engaging critically, demanding that the Church live up to the values it preaches. In the end, VATILEAKS teaches us something that transcends religion, that touches the core of what it means to be human in a world of institutions and power. It teaches that secrets carry weight, that prolonged silences eventually break, that no structure, no matter how sacred it proclaims itself, is immune to the need for accountability. And that truth, when it finally emerges, has the power to destroy, but also to purify. The leaked documents no longer shock as much as they did when they first appeared. Over time, they became part of history, analyzed by academics, debated by theologians, contextualized by historians. But their impact remains. VATILEAKS marked a before and after in the relationship between the Catholic Church and its faithful. It set a precedent that even the most protected secrets can be exposed, that even the most powerful institutions can be forced to confront their shadows. There was something inevitable about all of this, as if the very weight of secrets accumulated over centuries were demanding release, as if the Church, willingly or not, was being pushed into an era where opacity is no longer acceptable, where authority based solely on tradition is no longer sufficient, where the faithful demand not just faith, but also reason, Not just reverence, but also transparency. The true secret VATILEAKS revealed wasn't in the documents themselves. It was in what they symbolized, the eternal tension between the ideal and the real, between what we profess to be and what we truly are. The Church has always presented itself as the guardian of eternal truths, as a bridge between the human and the divine. But VATILEAKS showed that this bridge is built and maintained by human beings, with all their imperfections, their ambitions, their small betrayals, and their great fears. And perhaps this is precisely what history invites us to accept. Not as an excuse for mistakes, not as a justification for corruption, but as an honest recognition that no human institution, no matter how lofty its mission, will be free from the struggle with its own shadows. What matters is not the absence of flaws, but how we respond when they are exposed. Whether we hide even deeper in the shadows, protecting secrets with even greater vigor, or whether we use exposure as an opportunity for genuine transformation. The journey continues. Subscribe and follow us. Each new episode is a flame lit in the darkness. Because VATILEAKS is just one story in a much larger saga, the saga of how humanity and spirituality coexist in eternal conflict and eternal dance. The saga of how we seek the divine through imperfect institutions. The saga of how the sacred and the profane are always intertwined, and separating them completely may be impossible. But recognizing this intertwining is the first step toward a more mature faith. Write in the comments what silence told you today. Sometimes that's where the truth manifests itself, because each of us carries within us the same tension that VATILEAKS exposed at the Vatican. The tension between our ideals and our actions, between who we want to be and who we truly are, between the secrets we keep and the truths that would set us free if we had the courage to face them. The veil never completely lifts. There always remains an extra layer, a deeper mystery, a question with no easy answer. And perhaps that's exactly how it should be. Because if all the answers were given, if all the mysteries were solved, what would be left to seek? Faith, in the end, isn't about absolute certainties. It's about walking toward the light even when darkness is all we can clearly see. VATILEAKS remains a landmark, a reminder that buried truths eventually find their way to the surface. A warning that institutions that refuse to reform will eventually be forced to do so by circumstances. A hope that even in the deepest crises, there is opportunity for renewal. In the next episode, we'll enter another corridor of the secret archives, another seal waiting to be opened, another story that silence has kept hidden for too long. Because the Vatican is a labyrinth of mysteries, and each door we open reveals 10 others still closed. Each document that comes to light casts deeper shadows in corners we've yet to explore. But for now, let this story rest within you. Let the questions it raises echo in the silence of your own reflection. Because VATILEAKS doesn't ask you to choose a side, doesn't demand that you judge or condemn. It simply invites you to bear witness, and in bearing witness, to understand a little more about the complexity of the sacred when it needs to exist in the human world. The mystery remains, the veil remains, and we continue, eternal seekers, trying to discern light through layers and layers of history, tradition, secrecy, and faith.